So, in the novel Red Sparrow by Jason Matthews, what exactly happens? Well, first we're introduced to a character named Nate who works in the American Embassy in Moscow. And then, two, we're introduced to the character Dominika, who is a 25-year-old female who eventually makes her way up to become a dancer, but eventually has injured to the point where she can no longer dance. So, what happens to both these characters? Well, first, Nate is transferred to the American Embassy in Helsinki, Finland, and two, Dominika is employed as a Sparrow, an employee for the Russians. So, in so throughout the rest of the novel, novel from this point, Dominika meets Nate in the American Embassy in Finland, and both of them go on missions to work against the Russians who are doing illegal things in Finland. But throughout the nearly 30% of this novel that is taken up from this point, Dominic and Nika develop an interest in one another. They initially start off just mildly touching one another, then kissing each other, then eventually they go on in full action. Then from that point on, Nate is eventually transferred to New York City, where he is to work against the Russians there, and he doesn't expect Dominika to be fully legitimate in his actions against Russians while in America. So what happens from this point? So what happens next? One of the Russian spies goes to have a meeting with Vladimir Putin, and Vladimir Putin wants to have the Russians succeed and the West fail, just as you would expect from him. But for instance, Nate, who goes to the United States, ends up doing bad things with the Russians and arresting several of them. But when the Russians in Washington, D.C. hear about this, they know something about this, or they figure something out. Nate was responsible for the actions against the Russians, but also they figured he must have some spy with him in doing this against them. And that spy happens to be Dominika, as she clearly states this while in Moscow to people who are responsible for this operation. So we're at a point in the story where the two sides, the Russians and the Americans, are sort of turning against one another, and we can see this happening in this part of the novel. Putin, of course, says to Igorovna that we need to hold against the Americans, and the Americans, ruled by someone whose name I forgot, says we need to be against the Russians. But we see Dominika and Nate kind of be an analogy as to what the Russians are, or the Russians and the Americans are. Though they are opposed to each other, these two are lovers with one another, and of course are making love, as we see in this point of the novel. So the conflict is essentially a conflict of love between Dominika and Nate, but yeah, I should say they don't actually solve those two problems of the Russians and the Americans acting against one another. They're not for that. The novel ends with Dominika and Nate being basically on opposite sides of the conflict between one another, where Nate is told that he needs to stay away from the Russians, and Dominika being told that she's no good with the Russians, and even the Americans tell this to her. So not much left in the novel other than that. So, what do we learn from this novel? Well, we see that Dominica and Nate are very close to one another in a way that the Russians and the Americans aren't close to one another, and this conflict ends up leaving Dominica and Nate apart from one another. But I should like to say this novel is far less complex than the movie is complex. The movie has two major points. First is that Dominica wants to be dominant over her fellow officer and basically dominate her and dominate him in sex, rather than him being so dominant to basically rape her. In addition to that, the movie also explains how the Russians tortured Nate, a fellow American, and Dominica takes the American side and asks the Russians to leave him alone, and is hostile in doing so. Whereas the novel basically just
tells us about the love
between Dominica and Nate for all of its pages. So, in my view, the movie is more complex than the novel and far more intriguing.